The wind screamed across the Texas panhandle like a wounded animal, clawing at everything in its path. Grace Bennett pressed her face against the frosted window of the stagecoach, watching the world disappear into white fury. Snow came at them sideways, thick and relentless, turning the afternoon into twilight. She could no longer see the road, could barely see the horses struggling ahead, their dark shapes blurring into the storm. This was nothing like the gentle snowfalls of Philadelphia. This was nature at its most savage, and Grace was beginning to understand she might have made a terrible mistake. The letter was still tucked inside her traveling dress, pressed against her heart where she'd kept it for the past 3 weeks. Mr. Ezekiel Whitmore had written to her in careful, educated script, his words promising not just marriage, but partnership. A ranch of 1,000 acres, he'd written, good water, strong cattle, and a house with real glass windows. But more than that, he'd written about sunsets that painted the prairie gold, about the satisfaction of building something that would last beyond one lifetime, about the loneliness that came from having no one to share it with. Grace understood loneliness. She'd lived with it for the past 2 years, ever since consumption had taken her father and left her utterly alone in the world. The Presbyterian hospital had let her go 6 weeks after the funeral. Budget constraints, they'd said, though everyone knew they were only keeping nurses with completed certifications. 18 months of training, of learning to clean wounds and mix medicines and hold the hands of dying men, all worthless without that final piece of paper. She'd spent her last dollars on a room in a boarding house on Vine Street, a narrow space that smelled of cabbage and desperation. Every morning she'd walk to the hospital hoping they'd change their minds. Every evening she'd return to that cheerless room and tried to make a single meal stretch across 2 days. When the landlady had finally told her she had 1 week to pay or leave, Grace had gone to the library and spent the afternoon reading matrimonial advertisements. Mr. Whitmore's letter had been different from the others. Most men wrote brief, business-like descriptions of their property and needs. But Ezekiel Whitmore had written about books, about philosophy, about his belief that marriage should be a meeting of minds, as well as a legal arrangement. He'd asked about her education, her interests, her dreams. He'd sent $30 for her passage west. Grace had written back immediately, telling him the truth about her circumstances. No family, no dowry, no connections, just herself and her incomplete nursing training and her willingness to work hard. His response had come within 3 weeks. "Your honesty is a rare gift," he'd written. "A woman with medical knowledge would be invaluable to our community. I look forward to meeting you, Miss Bennett. The future awaits us both." Now that future was disappearing into the blizzard, and Grace was starting to wonder if she'd live long enough to see it. The coach lurched violently to one side, and she heard the driver cursing above the wind. Across from her, the only other passenger jerked awake with a grunt. His name was Cowboy, and he'd been drinking from a silver flask since they'd left the last way station. He was a whiskey drummer, he'd told her, traveling from town to town selling cases of bourbon to saloons and general stores. Now he blinked at the white chaos outside, and his ruddy face went pale. "Jesus," he muttered, "we should have stayed at the station." Grace had thought the same thing 2 hours ago. The station keeper, a grizzled man with knowing eyes, had warned them about the storm. "Wait it out," he'd said. "Could be 3 days, could be a week, but better to wait than to die." The driver had disagreed. 20 miles, he'd argued. Just 20 miles to the Circle W turnoff, and then the passengers could decide whether to push on or hole up at the ranch until the weather cleared. Grace had stayed silent, even though every instinct had told her to speak up, to insist they wait. But 20 miles had seemed so close, and her money was nearly gone. Every day of delay meant another day of paying for meals, another day of uncertainty. So she'd climbed back into the coach and told herself they'd make it through. The coach slowed, then stopped completely. Grace heard the driver climbing down, heard his boots crunch through snow that must already be several inches deep. When he wrenched open the door, Wind and snow exploded into the cabin, instantly coating everything in white. His name was Hawkins, and his face above his ice-crusted scarf looked haggard and frightened. "End of the line!" he shouted over the wind. Calloway lurched forward. "What are you talking about? We paid for passage to Mobeetie." "Horses can't go no further. I turn back now. Maybe I can make it to the station. I keep going. We all die out here." Grace felt her stomach drop. "You're leaving us? In this?" "There's a ranch about a mile north. Follow the fence line and you'll find it. Tell them Hawkins sent you." He was already backing away, moving toward the driver's seat. "Wait," Grace called, but he was gone, scrambling up to his perch. The coach began to turn, a slow, ponderous movement, and then it was moving away, swallowed by the white within seconds. Calloway stood in the open door, staring at the place where the coach had vanished. "He killed us," he said flatly. "That bastard just killed us." Grace grabbed her carpetbag and forced herself to step down into the snow. It came up past her ankles, soaking through her leather boots immediately. The cold was shocking, a physical thing that seemed to reach through her clothes and grab her bones. She'd thought she understood cold, having survived Philadelphia winters. She'd been wrong. Which way did he say? Calloway was looking around wildly, as if the storm might suddenly part and reveal their destination. North, following a fence line. Grace scanned the white chaos, searching for any sign of a fence. There was nothing, just wind and snow and the terrible understanding that they were alone. "I don't see any fence." "Neither do I. But standing here will kill us. We need to move." Grace started walking in what she hoped was north, forcing her legs through the deepening snow. Behind her, she heard Calloway cursing, then the crunch of his footsteps following. The wind fought her with every step. It wasn't just cold, it was malicious, shoving at her, trying to knock her down, finding every gap in her clothing and pouring ice into it. Snow stung her face like thrown sand. She pulled her scarf up over her nose and mouth, but that made it hard to breathe, made ice form on the wool with every exhale. She pulled it down again and accepted the burning pain of frozen air in her lungs. They walked. Grace had no way to know if they were going in the right direction. Visibility was perhaps 10 feet, maybe less. The fence Hawkins had mentioned was nowhere to be seen. For all she knew, they were walking in circles or heading straight back toward the road they'd just left, or angling off into empty prairie where they'd wander until they collapsed. Her mind tried to calculate how long they could survive in these conditions. She'd read about exposure in her medical texts. The body lost heat rapidly in wind and wet. Extremities went first, fingers and toes, the blood retreating to protect vital organs. Then confusion set in as the brain began to shut down. Then sleep, then death. In conditions like these, without shelter, a person might have an hour, maybe less. Her hands were already numb inside her gloves. She flexed her fingers, trying to keep blood moving, but she could barely feel them. Her feet were blocks of ice inside her boots. Every step required conscious effort, as if she were learning to walk for the first time. Behind her, Calloway had stopped talking. She turned to check on him and realized he was gone, just gone. She called his name, but the wind tore her voice away. She took several steps back, searching, but the falling snow had already erased his footprints. He'd either wandered off in a different direction, or fallen behind, or simply given up and sat down. Any of those options meant he was as good as dead. Grace stood alone in the storm and felt pure terror wash over her. Not the gentle fear of uncertainty, but raw animal panic at the knowledge of imminent death. She was going to die out here. Not someday, not in some distant abstract future, but soon, within the hour. Her body would freeze solid, and no one would find it until spring, if ever. She thought of her father, not as he'd looked at the end, skeletal and gasping, but as she remembered him from childhood, strong and laughing, his carpenter's hands rough but gentle when he'd brushed her hair. He'd taught her to read using the Bible and Shakespeare. He'd taught her that intelligence and determination could overcome almost any obstacle. He'd believed she could do anything, "I'm sorry, Papa," she whispered into the wind. "I tried." But her father's voice came back to her, strong and sure in her memory. "Trying isn't the same as quitting, Gracie girl. You keep moving until you can't move anymore. That's what Bennetts do." Grace moved, one foot forward, then the other, then the first again. It was all she could manage. Tiny steps, each one requiring enormous will. Her skirts were soaked and heavy, dragging at her legs. Her bag felt like it was filled with stones. She should drop it, she knew. But everything she owned was in that bag. The last photograph of her father. Her mother's wedding ring, somehow reclaimed from the pawn shop in a final act of sentimentality. The letters from Mr. Whitmore that had promised her a future. She fell. Her knee hit something hard beneath the snow, probably a rock, and pain shot through her leg. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. The cold had stolen them. She couldn't feel anything below her waist. This is it, she thought with strange clarity. This is where it ends. She thought about Mr. Whitmore's letters, still pressed against her heart. Had he ever really existed? Or was it all fraud, some elaborate scheme to extract money from desperate women? The $30 he'd sent would have seemed like a fortune to a clever con man. She'd never know now. She'd die here in the snow, 20 miles from a ranch she'd never see, sent by a man she'd never meet. The wind changed. Or maybe it had been changing all along, and she'd only just noticed. There was a rhythm beneath the howl now, a steady pounding sound. Grace lifted her head, squinting through the snow, and saw movement in the white. Something dark and large coming toward her. A horse. Someone was riding through the storm. She tried to call out, but her voice was gone, frozen somewhere in her chest. She tried to raise her hand, but her arm wouldn't respond. All she could do was watch as the shape resolved into a man on horseback, broad-shouldered and wrapped in heavy furs that made him look like some ancient warrior. He dismounted in one fluid motion and knelt beside her. She could see his eyes above the scarf that covered most of his face. They were startlingly blue, the color of summer sky, and they widened when they focused on her. "Hold on," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together, but there was something in it that made her want to weep. "I've got you." He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. Through all the layers of clothing, his and hers, she could feel heat radiating from him. It was the most wonderful thing she'd ever felt in her life. "There was another man," she managed to say, though her lips felt thick and clumsy. "A whiskey drummer. Calloway." "I'll find him." The man settled her onto the horse, then swung up behind her, his arm locked around her waist, holding her steady against his chest. "But first I get you inside. You're about 2 degrees from frozen solid." The horse began to move, and Grace let herself sag against the man's warmth. Her eyes kept trying to close. Sleep seemed like such a good idea. Just close her eyes for a moment, rest, let the darkness take her. "No, you don't." His voice sharpened, and he shook her slightly. "Stay awake. You hear me? You go to sleep now. You might not wake up. Talk to me." "About what?" The words came out slurred. "Anything. Tell me your name." "Grace. Grace Bennett." "That's good." "Where you from, Grace Bennett?" "Philadelphia." "Long way to come." "No choice. Nothing left there." He grunted, a sound that might have been understanding or just acknowledgement. "You're the one coming to marry old Whitmore." Hope flared in her chest, warm despite the killing cold. "You know him? Mr. Whitmore?" There was a pause before he answered. "Yeah, I know him." Is he a good man?" His letters seemed kind, but you can't always tell from letters." Another pause, longer this time. "He was a good man." Something in his tone made her uneasy, but before she could ask what he meant, buildings began to emerge from the white. First a large barn, its red paint faded but solid. Then several smaller outbuildings, their purposes unclear. Finally a house, bigger than she'd imagined, sprawling and 2-storied with a wide porch running along the front. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, the sight of it almost painfully beautiful. The man guided the horse up to the porch and dismounted, then lifted Grace down. Her legs buckled immediately, and he caught her, swinging her up into his arms again. "Rosa!" he shouted as he kicked the front door open. "Rosa, get out here!" The warmth inside hit Grace like a physical blow. After the numbing cold of the storm, it felt like fire against her skin. She whimpered as her frozen flesh began to register temperature again, the sensation somewhere between agony and relief. A woman appeared from a doorway to the left, small and round, with gray streaked black hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was weathered and kind, her dark eyes sharp as they took in Grace's condition. She said something rapid in Spanish, gesturing toward a door. The man carried Grace through into a bedroom. A fire blazed in the stone fireplace, the heat from it almost overwhelming. He laid her carefully on the bed and stepped back as the woman, Rosa, began stripping off Grace's wet clothes with brisk efficiency. "There was a man with her," he said, his voice tight. "Calloway," she said. "Whiskey drummer. Probably wandered off from where the stage left them. Then go find him before he dies." Rosa didn't look up from her work, her fingers quick on the buttons of Grace's dress. "I'll take care of the girl." He hesitated, and Grace looked up to find him staring down at her. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something she was too cold and confused to name. Then he turned and left, closing the door firmly behind him. Rosa worked in silence, removing Grace's sodden dress, her petticoats heavy with melted snow, her corset, her chemise, everything. She wrapped her in thick wool blankets that smelled of lavender and began rubbing her hands and feet, working, feeling back into frozen flesh. It hurt. God in heaven, it hurt. As blood flow returned, Grace's extremities began to burn as if someone were holding them over flames. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out, tasted copper as she broke the skin. "I know, mija," Rosa said softly, her accent thick but her English clear. "I know it hurts, but pain is good. Pain means you're alive. No pain would mean we're too late." She brought tea, dark and sweet, and almost too hot to drink. She held the cup to Grace's lips until her shaking hands could manage it herself. Then she brought soup, rich with beef and vegetables, and made her swallow it even though Grace's stomach wanted to reject the sudden warmth. Gradually, in small increments, the violent shaking subsided. The burning in her hands and feet faded to a fierce ache. Grace's mind, which had felt wrapped in wool, began to clear. "The man who brought me in," she said when she could finally form words properly. "What's his name?" Rosa looked at her carefully, as if weighing how much to say. "That's William Carter. Folks call him Will. He's the foreman here at the Circle W." "Foreman." Grace seized on the word. "Then Mr. Whitmore sent him? To find me?" Rosa's expression shifted, became guarded. She busied herself adjusting the blankets. "You should rest now, child. We can talk about everything else when you're stronger." "Please." Grace caught her hand. "I need to know, is Mr. Whitmore here? When can I meet him?" The older woman sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed. For a long moment she said nothing, just looked at Grace with something like pity in her dark eyes. "Mr. Whitmore is dead," she finally said. "He died 3 weeks ago. Heart gave out while he was checking the north pasture, fell right off his horse. Will found him that evening, but he was already gone." The words didn't make sense at first. Grace stared at Rosa, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part that would make it all make sense. But Rosa just sat there, sad and patient, while the truth slowly sank in. "That can't be right," Grace heard herself say. "He wrote to me. I have his letters." "When did you receive his last letter?" Grace tried to remember. The journey had been so long, the days blurring together. 6 weeks ago. Maybe 7. Rosa nodded slowly. "Then yes, he wrote it. But he's been in the ground these 3 weeks past. His son came up from Denver for the funeral, settled what legal matters needed settling. The ranch," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "the ranch is in trouble, mija. The bank holds the note and they're calling it in. We have until the end of March to pay what's owed, or they'll take everything. Grace felt the room tilt. Felt the room. She closed her eyes, but that made it worse, so she opened them again and focused on Rosa's face, using it as an anchor. His son. Did he know I was coming? Did anyone tell him? No one knew to tell him. Ezekiel kept his own counsel about personal matters. If he was corresponding with a woman about marriage, he didn't share that with any of us. So nobody knows. Grace's voice came out flat, emotionless. Nobody knows I sold everything I owned to come here. Nobody knows I spent my last $30 on train fare and stage passage. Nobody knows I'm here at all. Rosa's hand tightened on hers. How much money do you have left? Grace almost laughed. 85 cents. Family? Someone back east who could send you funds? My father died 2 years ago. I have no other family. No friends with money to spare. She met Rosa's eyes. I have nothing. I am nothing. The full weight of it crashed down on her then. She'd survived the blizzard only to find herself stranded on a failing ranch 1,000 miles from anywhere she knew, with less than $1 to her name. No family to wire for help, no prospects, no way forward and no way back. She waited for tears, but they didn't come. Maybe she was still too cold. Maybe she'd cried herself empty watching her father waste away. Maybe she was just too tired. Rest now, Rosa said, standing. She smoothed the blankets with gentle hands. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do. Tonight you're warm and safe and alive. That's more than you had an hour ago. She left, closing the door softly. Grace lay in the warm bed, wrapped in blankets that smelled like someone else's life, and listened to the storm rage outside. Through the walls she could hear voices, men's voices, many of them. Someone laughed. Someone called out a question she couldn't quite make out. The sounds of a household, of life continuing despite everything. She thought about Mr. Whitmore's letters. She'd read them so many times she had parts memorized. He'd written about loneliness, about how a man could be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. About building something that would outlast him, but having no one to share it with. About hoping that somewhere there was a woman who understood that true partnership was worth more than romance. She'd understood. She'd felt the same loneliness in crowded Philadelphia, surrounded by people who knew her face, but not her heart. Mr. Whitmore had offered her a cure for that. Not love, perhaps, at least not at first, but belonging, purpose, a reason to keep going, and now he was dead and she had nothing again. The door opened and Rosa came back in carrying a tray. Thought you might want more soup, and I brought you a nightgown. Yours are all wet. Thank you. Grace pushed herself up to sitting and accepted the bowl. The soup was even better than before, or maybe she was just hungry enough to appreciate it. She ate slowly, feeling strength return with each spoonful. Rosa hung Grace's wet clothes near the fire, spreading them carefully so they'd dry evenly. Will found your friend, she said quietly. The drummer. He was already gone when Will reached him. Froze to death maybe a quarter-mile from where he found you. The spoon stopped halfway to Grace's mouth. He's dead? I'm sorry. Grace set the bowl down. Calloway had been rude and drunk and not particularly pleasant company. But he'd been alive this morning. He'd told her about his daughter in St. Louis, about how he was saving money to bring her out west. Now he was dead and that daughter would never see her father again. I should have made him keep walking, Grace said. When he wanted to stop, I should have forced him. You did what you could. He made his choice. That's not your burden to carry. But it felt like it should be. Grace had kept going and lived. Calloway had stopped and died. The difference between survival and death was just the will to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And somehow she'd had it, and he hadn't. Rosa sat down on the edge of the bed again. She was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. You asked about Mr. Whitmore, she finally said. About whether anyone knew you were coming. I've been thinking about that. Ezekiel was a proud man, too proud sometimes. If he was writing to a woman about marriage, he wouldn't have told anyone until you arrived and it was settled. He wouldn't have wanted people talking, speculating. So his son really doesn't know. Benjamin Whitmore doesn't care about this ranch beyond what he can get for it. He works for the railroad in Denver, makes good money. This place is just property to him, something to be sold or settled. He came for the funeral because it was proper, but he couldn't wait to get back to his real life. Grace absorbed this. You said the bank is calling in the note. How much is owed? $3,200. It was a staggering sum, more money than Grace could imagine having. Can you pay it? Rosa's laugh was bitter. With what? We've got maybe 340 head of good cattle out there. At market prices in Dodge City, that's over $4,000, more than enough. But the trail to Dodge is closed until mid-March, maybe later if the snow keeps coming. By the time we can move the herd, it'll be too late. The bank will have taken everything. What about selling locally to other ranchers? Every rancher within 100 miles is in the same situation. Nobody has cash money for cattle right now. They're all just trying to hold on to what they have. Grace drank her soup and thought. There had to be a solution. There was always a solution if you looked at a problem from enough angles. She'd learned that from her father, who could figure out how to fix almost anything if you gave him time and tools. Will is the foreman, she said. How many men does he manage? 23, counting Will himself. Good men, most of them. Been with the Circle W for years, but with Ezekiel gone and the bank threatening, they're getting nervous. Some have already left to find work elsewhere. Can't blame them for wanting security. 23 men. Grace's mind began to calculate. That many men living and working in rough conditions meant injuries, accidents, illness. Is there a doctor nearby? Nearest doctor is in Mobeetie, 30 miles east. In good weather, that's a day's ride. In this, Rosa gestured toward the window where snow still fell thick and fast. Might as well be on the moon. So when someone gets hurt or sick, what do? I do what I can. I've been delivering babies and setting bones for 40 years now. Learned from my mother, and she learned from hers. But I'm not a trained doctor. Sometimes I can help, and sometimes I can't. An idea was forming in Grace's mind. A desperate idea, probably foolish, but it was better than nothing. I was training to be a nurse in Philadelphia, she said carefully, at the Presbyterian Hospital. I didn't finish my certification because they let me go when my father died, but I learned a great deal in 18 months. Wound care, basic diagnosis, how to assist with surgery. I helped treat over 40 pneumonia patients during an outbreak last year. Rosa's eyes sharpened with interest. Is that the truth? I wouldn't lie about something like that. I'm not a real doctor, and I'm not a certified nurse, but I know what I'm doing well enough to be useful, more useful than nothing. Out here, useful counts for more than certificates. Grace took a breath. If Will would let me stay, I could earn my keep. I could tend to the men when they're sick or injured. I could help you with whatever medical needs come up. I wouldn't ask for much. Just a place to sleep and food to eat until I can figure out what else to do. Rosa studied her face for a long moment. Then she smiled, a warm expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. I think you and I are going to get along just fine, mija. Get some sleep now. Tomorrow we'll talk to Will about making you an offer. She left again, taking the empty bowl. Grace slid down under the blankets, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Through the window she could see the storm was still raging, snow falling in thick sheets. It would blow all night probably, maybe into tomorrow, but she was warm and dry. She was alive, and tomorrow she would start fighting for a place to stay. Grace woke to silence, not the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but the profound hush that comes after a storm has finally exhausted itself. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting the unfamiliar room in shades of gold and cream. For a moment she lay still, orienting herself, remembering where she was and how she'd gotten here. The Circle W Ranch, 1,000 miles from Philadelphia. Ezekiel Whitmore dead and buried, 85 cents to her name, and nowhere else to go. She sat up slowly, testing her body. Her hands and feet ached with a deep bone bruise feeling, but she could move them. Her knee, which had struck that rock during her desperate walk through the blizzard, throbbed when she bent it, but it bore her weight. She was alive and functional. Given where she'd been yesterday afternoon, that counted as a miracle. Someone had left clothes folded on the chair by the fire. Not her traveling dress, which still hung drying near the hearth, but a simple day dress in dark blue wool and a white apron. Grace dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with the unfamiliar buttons. The dress was too short by several inches and loose through the bodice, but it was clean and warm, and that was all that mattered. She found her way through the house by following the smell of coffee and bacon. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with exposed beam ceilings and a stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole hog. A long table dominated the space, scarred and solid, with benches running along both sides. Doors led off in several directions, presumably to other bedrooms and storage areas. Rosa stood at a massive iron stove, tending several pans at once, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been cooking for crowds her entire life. She looked up when Grace entered and smiled. "Good morning, mija. You have color in your cheeks again. That's good. Sit, eat. You need strength." Grace sat at the table and accepted a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, biscuits, and something that looked like fried cornmeal. The food was simple but perfectly cooked, and she ate with an appetite she hadn't felt in months. Being half frozen and then warmed back to life had apparently awakened her body's demands. "Where is everyone?" Grace asked between bites. The house felt empty, though she could hear sounds from outside. Voices calling to each other, the whinny of horses, the general noise of work beginning. The men eat at first light, and they're already out working. Snow stopped around midnight, but there's 3 feet of it out there. They're digging out paths to the barn, checking on the cattle, making sure the storm didn't do too much damage. Rosa poured coffee into a heavy mug and set it in front of Grace. "Will wants to see you when you're done eating." Grace's stomach tightened despite the good food. "Did you tell him about my offer?" "I told him you're a nurse and you want to earn your keep. The rest is between you and him." She finished eating quickly, suddenly nervous. William Carter, the man who'd rescued her from the storm, who'd carried her into warmth and safety. She hadn't gotten a good look at him yesterday, bundled as he'd been in furs and scarves, but she remembered his eyes. Blue as summer sky, sharp and assessing. Rosa directed her to the barn. Grace wrapped herself in a borrowed coat, far too large but blessedly warm, and stepped out into a world transformed by snow. It lay everywhere in great white drifts, sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes. The sky above was painfully blue, the kind of clear cold blue that only comes after winter storms. Her breath came out in white puffs that hung in the still air. The path to the barn had been shoveled clear, the snow walls on either side rising above her head. Her boots crunched on the packed snow as she walked, the sound loud in the crystalline quiet. Ahead, the barn doors stood open, and she could hear activity inside. Men's voices, the stamp and shuffle of horses, the familiar sounds of morning work. She paused in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The barn was enormous, with stalls running down both sides and a wide center aisle. Perhaps a dozen horses occupied the stalls, and men moved between them with buckets and brushes and hay forks. They worked with the easy coordination of people who'd done these same tasks together for years. One man stood apart from the others near a stall at the far end. He was tall, she saw now, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained the fabric of his sheepskin coat. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and long enough to brush his collar. He wore it pushed back from his face, revealing strong features that looked carved from the same hard country that surrounded them. William Carter. Will. He looked up as if sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the length of the barn. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he straightened and walked toward her, his boots loud on the wooden floor. The other men stopped working to watch, their curiosity obvious even if they tried to hide it. Up close, Will Carter was even more imposing than she'd realized. Not just tall, but solid, built with the kind of muscle that came from years of hard physical work. His face was weathered, with lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of time spent squinting into sun and wind. A scar ran along his left jawline, old and white, its origin a mystery. But it was his eyes that held her. Blue and clear and utterly direct, they looked at her as if taking her measure down to the bone. Miss Bennett. His voice was the same one she remembered from yesterday, deep and rough. Rosa says you're a nurse. I was training to be one. I didn't finish my certification. Can you set a broken bone? Yes. Stitch a wound? Yes. Treat pneumonia, fever, infections? I can do all of those things. I'm not a doctor, but I know basic field medicine. He studied her for another long moment. Grace forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, to not look away or fidget. She'd learned in the hospital that men respected confidence, even if you had to fake it. "Follow me," Will said finally, and turned back toward the stalls. Grace followed, aware of the other men watching. They didn't stare openly, but she could feel their eyes tracking her progress. A woman in their domain, young and Eastern and unknown. She was an oddity, something to be studied and discussed later. Will stopped at a stall near the end of the row. Inside, a cowboy sat on an overturned bucket, cradling his left arm against his chest. He was young, maybe 20, with a thin face and frightened eyes. When he saw Grace, those eyes widened further. "This is Jake," Will said. "Broke his arm yesterday afternoon when his horse spooked and threw him. Rosa set it and splinted it, but it's not healing right. He's got fever, and the arm's swelling." Grace stepped into the stall and knelt beside Jake. "May I see?" He hesitated, then slowly extended his arm. Rosa had done good work with the splint, using straight branches bound with strips of cloth. But even through the wrapping, Grace could see the swelling Will had mentioned. The arm was nearly twice its normal size, the skin stretched and shiny. "I need to unwrap this," she said gently. "It's going to hurt." Jake nodded, his jaw tight. Grace worked carefully, unwinding the cloth strips. When she finally removed the splint, she had to suppress a wince. The break was bad, with the bone visibly displaced beneath the skin. Worse, the flesh around it was hot and red, classic signs of infection setting in. "How long ago did this happen?" she asked. "Yesterday morning," Jake said through gritted teeth. "I was trying to move one of the heifers, and my horse stepped in a drift, went down hard." Grace examined the arm carefully, probing the swollen tissue with gentle fingers. Jake hissed in pain but didn't pull away. She could feel heat radiating from the injury, could see the telltale red streaks beginning to spread up toward his shoulder. If the infection reached his bloodstream, he'd be dead in days. She stood and looked at Will. "The bone needs to be reset. It wasn't aligned properly the first time, and now infection is setting in. If we don't deal with this today, he'll lose the arm, possibly his life." Will's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Can you fix it?" "I can try, but I'll need help. Someone strong to hold him still while I work. And I'll need supplies. Clean cloth, whiskey for sterilization, something for him to bite down on." "I'll hold him." Will looked at one of the other cowboys who'd drifted closer. "Tommy, get what she needs. Move fast." Tommy, an older man with gray streaks in his dark hair, nodded and hurried off. Grace knelt beside Jake again and took his good hand. "Listen to me," she said, making sure he met her eyes. "This is going to be the worst pain you've ever felt. I have to break the bone again, properly this time, and set it straight. You'll want to scream, and that's fine. You'll want to pass out, and that's better. But you have to stay as still as you can. If you jerk away at the wrong moment, I could make it worse. Do you understand?" Jake's face had gone pale, but he nodded. "Will it save my arm?" "If we do it right, and the infection doesn't spread, yes." "Then do it." Tommy returned with an armful of supplies. Clean white cloth that looked like it had been torn from sheets, a bottle of whiskey, and a thick piece of leather. Grace laid everything out carefully, arranging her workspace as she'd been taught. Preparation was half the battle. If you had everything you needed within reach, you could work quickly and efficiently. She poured whiskey over her hands, washing them thoroughly. The cowboys watching this gave each other looks but said nothing. Let them think her strange. Better strange than careless. Put the leather between your teeth, she told Jake. Bite down hard. Will, hold his shoulders. Keep him as still as you can. Will positioned himself behind Jake, his large hands settling on the young man's shoulders with surprising gentleness. Grace took the broken arm in both hands, feeling for the displaced bone through the swollen flesh. On 3, she said. 1, 2. She pulled on 3, not waiting for the count to finish. The trick was to move before the patient could tense up. Jake screamed around the leather, his whole body jerking, but Will held him firm. Grace felt the bone grate and shift beneath her fingers, almost there. She adjusted her grip and pulled again, harder this time, feeling for the precise moment when the broken ends aligned. There. A subtle change in resistance, bone meeting bone in proper configuration. She held the position, not daring to breathe, while she reached for the splint materials with her free hand. Tommy, I need you to hold his wrist, exactly where I have it now. Don't let it move, even a fraction. Tommy stepped forward and took over, his weathered hands steady. Grace quickly fashioned a proper splint, using more padding than Rosa had, wrapping it tighter to prevent any movement. She worked fast, but carefully, aware that every second counted. When she finished, she sat back and examined her work. The arm was still swollen, but the bone was properly aligned now. If infection didn't take hold, if fever didn't set in, if bone healed straight and true, Jake would keep his arm and most of its function. She cleaned the skin around the break with whiskey, watching Jake's face go gray with pain. Then she wrapped the whole arm in clean cloth and fashioned a sling to keep it immobilized against his chest. Keep this dry and clean, she told him. Don't use the arm for anything, not even to scratch your nose. If the fever gets worse or you see red streaks spreading, tell me immediately. I'll need to check it twice a day for the next week. Jake nodded weakly. The leather had fallen from his mouth, and there were tears on his face, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been. Thank you, miss. Grace stood, her knees protesting. She'd been kneeling on hard wood for nearly 20 minutes, and her body was letting her know about it. She turned to find Will watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That was well done, he said quietly. It was necessary. Rosa did her best, but she didn't have the training to recognize a poor set. Another day, and you would have lost him. How many men have you treated before coming here? Grace thought back to her time at the hospital. I worked directly with patients for 18 months, hundreds of them. Most were surgery or disease cases, but we got plenty of accidents too. Factory injuries, construction accidents, street fights. I've seen most of what can go wrong with a human body. Will nodded slowly, still studying her. Rosa told me your situation, about Whitmore's letters, about you having no money to leave. She said you offered to work as a nurse in exchange for room and board. That's right. I can't pay you. The ranch is barely making enough to keep the men we have. Come March, if we can't pay what's owed to the bank, everyone here will be out of work anyway. Grace had expected this. I don't need pay. I need a place to stay while I figure out what comes next. If I can be useful in the meantime, all the better. You'd be more than useful. We've had 3 men die in the last 2 years from injuries and sickness that a real doctor might have saved them from. Rosa does what she can, but she's not trained. Having you here, he paused, choosing his words. It could make the difference between men living and dying. Then let me stay. Will was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes searching her face as if looking for something hidden beneath the surface. Grace met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. Finally he nodded. All right, you can stay. We'll set up the old foreman's cabin as an infirmary. It's been empty since the last foreman died, but it's sound and it's got a good stove. You'll have your own space to work and sleep. Relief flooded through Grace, so intense it made her dizzy. A place to stay, work to do, time to figure out her next move. It wasn't what she'd come west hoping for, but it was survival. Right now, that was enough. "Thank you," she said. Will's expression softened slightly, the hard lines around his mouth easing. "Thank me by keeping my men alive. That'll be payment enough." The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Will was as good as his word about the cabin. On the third night, Grace woke to shouting from the barn. She threw on her coat over her nightgown, grabbed her medical bag, and ran through the cold darkness. Inside the barn, lamplight illuminated a crisis in progress. A chestnut mare lay on her side in the straw, her flanks heaving, eyes rolling white with pain. Will knelt beside the horse, one hand on her swollen belly. "Foal's positioned wrong. Been in labor 6 hours and nothing's happening. If we don't turn it soon, we'll lose them both." 2 cowboys stood nearby, their faces grim. Grace had never delivered a foal before, but she'd assisted with difficult human births at the hospital. The principles couldn't be that different. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, setting down her bag. Will looked surprised to see her, but didn't waste time questioning. "I need to reach inside and feel what's wrong, but I can't do it alone. Someone has to keep her calm, monitor her breathing, tell me if she starts failing. I can do that." For the next hour, they worked in tense coordination. Grace knelt at the mare's head, one hand on her neck, feeling the rabbit fast pulse, whispering meaningless reassurances while Will worked at the other end. His face was tight with concentration, sweat beading on his forehead despite the winter cold seeping through the barn walls. "Got it," he said finally. "Front leg was folded back. I can feel the nose now. When I say push, you press down on her belly, right here." He guided Grace's free hand to the correct spot on the mare's flank. They worked together, Grace applying pressure when Will commanded, releasing when he said to wait. His hands disappeared inside the mare up to his elbows, his jaw set with effort. The mare groaned, a sound that seemed too human. "Now," Will said, "hard as you can." Grace pushed with all her strength. The mare convulsed beneath her hands. Then suddenly Will was pulling, and the foal was sliding free in a rush of fluid, legs tangling, impossibly fragile. It lay still for one terrible moment. Then it shook its head, took a gasping breath, and tried to stand on legs that didn't quite work yet. Grace found herself laughing with pure relief. Will was grinning too, his shirt soaked with sweat, and worse, but his eyes bright. Their gazes met over the newborn, and something passed between them. Something warm and real that had nothing to do with medical emergencies or ranches or obligations. "You did good," he said softly. "Real good. We did it together." Grace became aware that her hand was still on his arm, that neither of them had moved away. Will looked at her hand, then back at her face. "Grace, He stopped, seeming to reconsider. "Thank you for coming out here, for knowing what to do." The moment stretched, fragile as the foal trying to stand. Then one of the cowboys cleared his throat, and it broke. Will stood, putting professional distance between them, but the warmth in his eyes remained. He set several men to clearing it out, sweeping away dust and mouse nests, checking the roof for leaks and the stove for cracks. By the second afternoon it was habitable, and by the third it looked almost homely with a proper bed installed and shelves built for supplies. Rosa helped Grace inventory what medical equipment was available. It wasn't much. A few bottles of laudanum, some carbolic acid for disinfection, bandages in various states of wear. Grace made a list of what she needed, and Rosa promised to order it from Mobeetie when the roads cleared. Word spread quickly among the cowboys that there was a real nurse on the ranch now. They came to Grace with complaints they'd been ignoring for months, old injuries that had healed wrong, coughs that wouldn't go away, mysterious pains and worrying symptoms. She treated each man with the same careful attention, building trust, one patient at a time. Jake's arm began to heal properly. The fever broke on the second day, and the swelling started to go down. When Grace checked it each morning and evening, she could see healthy pink tissue instead of angry red infection. It would be weeks before he had full use of the arm again, but he'd keep it. That was what mattered. On the fourth day, Will came to the infirmary just after dawn. Grace was boiling instruments over the stove, preparing for the day's work. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Morning," he said. "Good morning. Is someone hurt?" "No, I came to ask if you ride." The question surprised her. "Horses? I've ridden a few times. Gentle horses in city parks. Nothing like what you have here. Would you be willing to learn?" Grace set down the pot she'd been holding. "Why?" "Because I need to check on the cattle in the north pasture. It's a 2-day ride there and back. Rosa can handle things here, but if something happens to me out there, I'd rather have someone along who knows medicine." He paused. "And I figured you might want to see more of the ranch than just the inside of this cabin." The offer was unexpected and oddly touching. Grace had been so focused on establishing herself as useful that she hadn't thought about the larger world beyond the ranch compound. The idea of riding out across the open prairie, of seeing this country that had almost killed her, held a strange appeal. "All right," she said. "When do we leave?" "Hour from now. Dress warm and bring whatever medical supplies you think we might need." He left before she could ask more questions. Grace packed quickly, choosing items that would be useful in the field. Bandages, sutures, laudanum for pain, carbolic acid, a scalpel. She wrapped everything carefully in oilcloth and stuffed it into saddlebags Rosa provided. The horse Will led out for her was a mare, bay-colored and calm-eyed. "This is Molly," he said. "Gentlest horse we've got. She'll take care of you, even if you don't know what you're doing." Grace approached slowly, letting Molly sniff her hand before stroking the velvety nose. The mare whuffed softly and leaned into the touch. "Have you ridden Western saddle before?" Will asked. "I've only ridden English, side saddle." His eyebrows rose. "Side saddle won't work out here. You'll need to ride astride. Can you do that in a dress?" Grace looked down at her borrowed clothing. The dress was full enough, she supposed, if she didn't mind showing her ankles. "I'll manage." Will showed her how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to sit balanced in the deeper Western saddle. His instructions were patient and clear, his hands steadying her when she wobbled. When she was finally settled, he swung up onto his own horse with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood. They set out toward the north, following a track that was barely visible beneath the snow. Will rode ahead, breaking trail, while Grace followed on Molly. The mare lived up to her reputation, picking her way carefully through drifts and over rough ground without needing much guidance. The ranch compound disappeared behind them, and Grace found herself in a landscape of stunning emptiness. Snow-covered plains stretched in every direction, broken only by occasional stands of bare trees or rocky outcroppings. The sky was enormous, a blue dome that seemed to reach down and touch the earth at the horizon. The silence was profound, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the soft crunch of hooves through snow. They rode for hours. Grace's thighs began to ache from the unaccustomed position, and her back protested the constant motion. But she didn't complain. This was a test, she realized. Will wanted to see if she could handle the physical demands of ranch life, if she'd whine and demand to turn back or push through discomfort. She'd push through. She'd survived worse than sore muscles. Around midday they stopped to rest the horses. Will produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, and they ate standing up, neither willing to sit in the snow. Grace chewed the tough, dried meat and looked out across the endless white. "How much land does the ranch cover?" she asked. 1,000 acres, give or take. Whitmore bought it 20 years ago when land was cheap and nobody wanted a ranch this far out. Built it into something solid, good water, decent grazing. It could support twice the cattle we've got now if we had the money to buy stock. And now the bank wants it. Bank wants everything. They loaned Whitmore money 3 years back to expand the herd. He was paying it off steady until he died. Now they say the note's due in full, end of March, or they take the land. Grace did quick mathematics in her head. Rosa said you have 340 head of cattle. At market prices, that's more than enough to pay the debt. At Dodge City prices, sure, but we can't get the herd to Dodge until the trail's clear, and that won't be until mid-March at earliest. By the time we drive them there and get them sold, it'll be April. Too late. What about selling them locally? To who? Every rancher in 100 miles is in the same fix. Nobody's buying, everyone's selling. If we tried to move the cattle now, we'd get maybe half what they're worth. That wouldn't even cover what's owed. They remounted and rode on. The sun tracked across the sky, painting the snow in shades of gold and blue. Grace found herself relaxing into the rhythm of Molly's gait, her body learning to move with the horse instead of fighting it. Late afternoon brought them to a place where the land rose slightly, forming a low ridge. Will guided them to the top and reined in his horse. Grace pulled up beside him and caught her breath. Below them, spread across a wide valley, were the cattle. 340 head, Will had said, but seeing them all together was different than knowing the number. They were massive creatures, longhorns with wicked spreads that looked like they could gore a man with casual ease. They'd been dug paths through the snow to reach the grass beneath, and cowboys rode among them on alert horses, keeping watch. "There's the Circle W," Will said quietly. 20 years of work, 20 years of Whitmore building something that would last. Grace heard something in his voice, an emotion he wasn't quite hiding. "You cared about him, about Mr. Whitmore. He gave me a job when nobody else would. I'd been drifting, working as a hand here and there, drinking too much and fighting more. He took a chance on a worthless cowboy and made him foreman, taught me how to manage men, how to think beyond the next paycheck." Will stared down at the cattle, his jaw tight. "I owe him everything, and now I'm going to lose it all because I can't figure out how to save his ranch." The admission surprised Grace. Will Carter didn't seem like a man who admitted failure easily. She looked down at the herd, at the cowboys working among them, at the vast empty land stretching in all directions. "There has to be a way," she said. "There's always a way if you look hard enough." Will glanced at her, something almost like hope in his eyes. "You believe that?" "I have to. Because if there's not, then what's the point of trying?" They rode down to the herd and Will introduced her to the cowboys working the valley, hard men with weather-beaten faces and eyes that had seen too much hardship. They touched their hats politely to Grace, but she could see their skepticism. An Eastern woman on a ranch meant trouble, their expression said, meant complications and demands and things breaking that used to work fine. She'd proved them wrong, just like she'd proved Will wrong by properly setting Jake's arm. They made camp as the sun set, building a fire in the lee of a rock outcropping that provided some shelter from the wind. Will showed Grace how to unsaddle Molly, how to rub the mare down and check her hooves for stones. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that came from shared purpose rather than forced conversation. Dinner was beans and bacon cooked over the fire, washed down with coffee so strong it made Grace's eyes water. But it was hot and filling, and after a day in the saddle she was hungry enough to appreciate anything. Full darkness brought stars, more stars than Grace had ever imagined existed. They filled the sky from horizon to horizon, so thick in places they looked like spilled milk. She lay on her bedroll, wrapped in blankets Will had provided, and stared up at that impossible display. "Makes you feel small, doesn't it?" Will's voice came from his own bedroll a few feet away. "Looking at all that?" "Small, but not insignificant," Grace said, "like we're part of something larger than ourselves." "Your father teach you that? To see the bigger picture?" "He taught me a lot of things. How to think, how to work, how to keep going when everything seems hopeless." She was quiet for a moment. He would have liked this, the stars, the space. He spent his whole life in Philadelphia, building other people's houses. I think he would have liked to see country where you could build your own. What did he die from? Consumption. It took him slow, 2 years of getting weaker, coughing more. By the end he could barely breathe. I watched him suffocate by inches, and there was nothing I could do. Grace's voice remained steady, but she felt the old grief rising. That's why I wanted to be a nurse, to help people the way I couldn't help him. Will was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. I understand that. Wanting to fix things because you couldn't fix the one thing that mattered. Grace turned her head to look at him. His face was barely visible in the firelight, but she could see enough to catch his expression. What couldn't you fix? My wife, Sarah. The name came out rough, like he didn't say it often. She died 5 years ago. Pneumonia took her in 3 days. I was out with the herd when it started. By the time I got back to the ranch, she was already gone. The pain in his voice was raw, despite the years. Grace knew that kind of grief. It didn't fade, just became something you learned to carry. I'm sorry, she said. We'd only been married 2 years. She was 23, same age as you are now. He paused. She hated it here, the isolation, the work, the danger. She'd grown up in San Antonio, in a real house with neighbors and stores. This, he gestured at the darkness around them, this was like exile to her. Then why did she stay? Because she loved me, or thought she did. Will's laugh was bitter. I was so sure I could make her happy, that she'd learn to love the land the way I did. But you can't make someone love what they fear. And she was afraid out here, afraid of the loneliness, the storms, the things that could go wrong with no help for miles. Grace thought about her own fear in the blizzard, about how close she'd come to giving up and lying down in the snow. Fear isn't weakness, she said. Sometimes it's the only reasonable response. Maybe, but it's a hard way to live. They fell silent after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Grace listened to the fire crackle and the distant sounds of cattle settling for the night. Somewhere out in the darkness, a coyote called, lonely and wild. She should be afraid, she thought. A woman alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew. But she wasn't. Will Carter had saved her life. Whatever else he might be, he wasn't a danger to her. She woke before dawn to find Will already up, rebuilding the fire and setting coffee to boil. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep blue to pale gold. Grace crawled out of her bedroll and stood, stretching muscles that had stiffened overnight. "Sleep all right?" Will asked, not looking up from his work. "Well enough. Better than I expected." He poured coffee and handed her a tin cup. "We'll head back after we check the cattle one more time. Should be back to the ranch by early evening." They broke camp efficiently, packing gear and saddling horses as the sun rose. Grace's body protested the return to the saddle, but she ignored it. Pain was temporary. What mattered was proving she could do this, that she belonged here. The ride back was quieter than the journey out. Will seemed lost in thought, and Grace didn't intrude. She used the time to observe the land, to notice details she'd missed before. The way snow had drifted against the north sides of rises, the tracks of animals, rabbits and coyotes and things she couldn't identify. The scattered bones of long-dead cattle, picked clean by scavengers. This was a hard land. Beautiful but merciless. It would kill you if you made mistakes, and sometimes even if you didn't. The people who survived here had to be equally hard, equally unforgiving. Yet Will had shown her kindness. Rosa had taken her in. The cowboys had accepted her presence, if not yet her authority. Maybe hardness and kindness weren't opposites. Maybe you needed both to survive out here. They reached the ranch compound as the sun touched the western horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. Grace slid down from Molly's back and nearly collapsed when her legs refused to hold her weight. Will caught her elbow, steadying her. "First long ride's always the hardest," he said. "You'll be sore tomorrow, but it gets easier. Promise?" "Promise." Rosa met them at the barn, worry creasing her face. "Thank God you're back. We've got trouble." Will's expression sharpened. "What kind of trouble?" "Garrison showed up this morning. He's waiting in the house." The name meant nothing to Grace, but she saw Will's jaw tighten. "What does he want?" "To talk about the note. He says the bank's moving up the deadline." Will swore a long creative string of profanity. Then he handed his horse's reins to one of the cowboys and headed for the house with long strides. Grace followed, her exhaustion forgotten. The man waiting in Whitmore's study was everything she'd expected a frontier banker to be. Expensive suit, carefully groomed beard, soft hands that had never done manual labor. He stood when they entered, his eyes flicking over Grace with brief curiosity, before dismissing her as unimportant. "Carter," he said, "I was beginning to think you'd run off. What do you want, Garrison?" Will didn't sit, didn't offer his hand, didn't pretend at civility. "The board has decided to accelerate the foreclosure timeline. We want payment in full by February 15th. That's 1 week from today." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Grace saw Will's hands curl into fists at his sides. "That wasn't the agreement," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Whitmore had until end of March. Whitmore is dead. The terms of the note allow us to call it in immediately upon the death of the borrower. We've been generous in giving you this long." Garrison pulled a document from his coat pocket. "This is official notice. 1 week, Carter, $3,200, or this land becomes property of the Cattlemen's Bank of Mobeetie. You know damn well we can't get that kind of money in 1 week. The cattle can't be moved until the trail's clear." "That's unfortunate, but not my problem." Garrison tucked the document back into his pocket. "You're a good foreman, Carter. When we take possession, we'll need someone to manage the transition. I could offer you a position if you're interested. Good wages, secure employment." The look Will gave him could have stripped paint. "Get off this land," Garrison shrugged. "Suit yourself. But the offer stands. Think about it." He nodded to Grace. "Ma'am." Then he was gone, his expensive boots loud on the wooden floor. Will stood frozen for a moment, staring at nothing. Then he slammed his fist into the wall hard enough to make the whole house shake. Grace waited until the sound of Garrison's horse had faded before speaking. "There has to be something we can do." "Like what? Rob a bank? Find gold buried under the barn?" Will's laugh was harsh. "We're finished. 1 week. Even if we could move the cattle tomorrow, we couldn't get to market and back with the money in 1 week. What about selling them locally? You said prices would be bad, but surely something is better than nothing." "I checked already. Best offer I could get was $4 a head. That's $1,360, less than half what we need." Grace's mind raced through possibilities, each one hitting a dead end. No time to drive cattle, no local buyers with real money, no hidden reserves or wealthy benefactors, just hard mathematics and an impossible deadline. Wait, an idea was forming, wild and probably foolish, but an idea nonetheless. "What about the Army?" she asked. Will looked at her blankly. "What about them?" "Fort Supply. You mentioned it yesterday. How far is it?" "Maybe 40 miles west. Why?" "Because an Army fort needs beef. They have hundreds of soldiers to feed, and I'd bet they buy most of their meat from contractors who charge premium prices. If we could sell directly to the fort quartermaster, we'd get better than local prices. Maybe not Dodge City prices, but better." Will stared at her. "The fort's been buying from Sterling's outfit out of Kansas for years. They have a contract. Contracts can be broken if someone offers better terms. We could offer them cattle at below contract price, delivered direct. No middleman. They save money. We get more than we'd get selling locally. It might not cover the whole debt, but it could get us close." She could see him thinking it through, weighing possibilities. His face was hard to read, but something had shifted in his eyes, something that might have been hope. "It's a long shot," he said finally. "It's the only shot we have." Will was quiet for another moment. Then he nodded, decision made. "All right, we leave tomorrow at first light. You, me, and Tommy to help drive a sample herd. If we can convince the quartermaster to buy, we'll have the rest of the cattle there within 3 days." Grace felt something fierce and warm bloom in her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but the possibility of it. "We can do this." "Maybe." Will's expression was still guarded, but there was life in it now. Purpose. "But first, we have to survive selling my plan to 23 cowboys who aren't going to want to drive cattle 40 miles through snow in the middle of winter. He was right to worry. When Will called the men together that evening and explained the plan, the response was exactly what Grace had feared: anger, skepticism, outright refusal. "It's suicide," one man declared. "Driving cattle in this weather, we'll lose half the herd before we get there." "And if we don't try, we lose everything," Will shot back. "The bank takes it all in 1 week. This is our chance, maybe the only one we'll get." The arguments went back and forth, voices rising, tempers flaring. Grace stood to one side, watching Will try to hold his men together through force of will. Some were with him, loyal enough to try anything. Others were already mentally checking out, planning their next jobs elsewhere. Finally, Rosa stepped forward, her small frame commanding attention despite her size. "Enough. You want to argue or you want to save this ranch? Because I've been here 20 years, and I'm not giving it up without a fight. Anyone too scared to try can leave now. The rest of us have work to do." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, the cowboys began to nod. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to make the attempt possible. That night, Grace lay in her narrow bed in the infirmary and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, they would ride to Fort Supply with their desperate offer. Tomorrow, they would find out if this wild plan had any chance of working. Tomorrow, the future of the Circle W would be decided one way or another. She thought about her father, about the lessons he'd taught her. Keep going when things seem hopeless. Look for solutions instead of dwelling on problems. Fight for what matters even when the odds are impossible. The Circle W mattered. These people mattered. Will Carter, with his grief and loyalty and fierce determination, mattered. Grace closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it challenges she could barely imagine. But she'd face them the same way she'd faced everything else since leaving Philadelphia. One step at a time, moving forward, refusing to quit. It was all anyone could do. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Circle W, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of rose and gold. Grace stood in the barn doorway, watching the cowboys prepare for the cattle drive to Fort Supply. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking saddles and tightening cinches, their breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The plan was simple, perhaps too simple. Drive 40 head of prime cattle 40 miles west. Convince the Army quartermaster to buy the entire Circle W herd at a price that would save the ranch, and do it all in less than a week. Simple, and probably impossible. Will emerged from the tack room carrying an extra saddle blanket. He'd been up half the night, Grace knew, going over numbers and routes and contingencies. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but his jaw was set with determination. This was a man who'd decided to fight. Consequences be damned. "You don't have to come," he said, stopping beside her. "This is going to be hard traveling, cold nights, long days in the saddle. No one would think less of you for staying here with Rosa." Grace pulled her borrowed coat tighter. "I'm coming. You might need a nurse if something goes wrong." "When something goes wrong," Will corrected. "Driving cattle in winter, something always goes wrong. Then you definitely need me." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. "Stubborn woman." "Stubborn enough to survive a blizzard? I think I can handle a cattle drive." They rode out an hour later, Grace on Molly and Will on a big roan gelding named Buck. Tommy rode Point, an older cowboy whose weathered face suggested he'd seen everything the frontier could throw at him. Behind them came 40 head of Circle W cattle, prime beef on the hoof, worth perhaps $6 each locally, but hopefully more to an army that needed steady supply. The other cowboys stayed behind to prepare the rest of the herd for quick movement if the Fort Supply gamble paid off. Grace had seen the doubt in their faces as they'd saddled up. They thought this was a fool's errand, a desperate last gasp before inevitable failure. Maybe they were right. But Will was trying, and that counted for something. The first day's ride was brutal. The temperature never climbed above freezing despite brilliant sunshine, and wind scoured the open prairie with relentless force. Grace's face went numb beneath her scarf, her fingers stiff inside thick gloves. Molly plodded along steadily, following Buck without needing much guidance, which was fortunate because Grace's attention was consumed by simply staying warm enough to function. The cattle moved reluctantly, unused to winter travel, protesting with bellows and stubborn stops. Will and Tommy worked them patiently, never rushing, letting the herd set its own pace. Grace watched the way they read the animals, anticipating which ones would try to break away, which needed extra encouragement. It was a dance she didn't know the steps to, but she could appreciate the skill required. They made camp that night in a shallow draw that offered some protection from the wind. Will built a fire while Tommy tended the horses and Grace unpacked supplies. The cattle bunched together for warmth, their breath rising in great clouds of steam. In the firelight they looked almost prehistoric, massive horned beasts from some ancient age. Dinner was beans and hardtack washed down with coffee that could strip rust. Grace ate mechanically, too tired to taste much. Every muscle in her body ached from hours in the saddle, and her face felt raw from windburn. But she'd made it through the day without complaining, without asking to turn back. That was a small victory. 20 miles today, Will said, staring into the fire. If we can do 20 tomorrow, we'll reach the fort by midday the day after. And if the quartermaster says no, Tommy asked the question they were all thinking, then we've wasted 3 days and 40 head of cattle we could have sold locally. Will's voice was flat. And the ranch is finished. The weight of those words settled over them like the darkness beyond the firelight. Everything rode on this gamble. Not just the ranch, but the futures of 23 men who'd built their lives around the Circle W. If this failed, they'd scatter to other outfits, other territories, leaving behind years of work and loyalty. Grace pulled her blankets tighter and looked up at the stars. They blazed overhead with cold brilliance, indifferent to human struggles. Somewhere under that same sky, her father was buried in a Philadelphia cemetery. If he could see her now, would he be proud? Or would he think she'd lost her mind, risking everything on a ranch that wasn't even hers, for people she'd known less than 2 weeks? She thought he'd be proud. He'd always valued loyalty and courage over safety. "Tell me about Fort Supply," she said, breaking the silence. "What's the quartermaster like?" Will poked at the fire with a stick. "Captain Andrew Morrison. Career Army by the book doesn't suffer fools. He's been buying beef from Sterling's outfit for 3 years. They have a contract that gives them exclusive supply rights. Contracts can be renegotiated. Not easily. Sterling's connected, has friends in the territorial government. He won't like us cutting into his business. Will he try to stop us? Depends on how much money is at stake. If we're talking about a one-time purchase, probably not. But if we're proposing to become the fort's regular supplier, that's different. That's his livelihood we're threatening." Grace absorbed this. She'd assumed the challenge would be convincing the army to buy their cattle. She hadn't considered that they might be starting a war with an established contractor. What kind of man is Sterling? The kind who doesn't lose gracefully. Will's voice carried warning. If he sees us as a threat, he'll fight back, politically, legally, maybe other ways. "Other ways?" Tommy spat into the fire. "Sterling's crew aren't all cowboys, if you take my meaning. Some of them are the kind of men you hire when you need problems solved the hard way." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "You're saying he might try to hurt us or sabotage the drive?" "I'm saying we need to be careful," Will said. "Eyes open, guns loaded. Sterling's a businessman, but he's also a man who likes to win. He won't take kindly to competition." They bedded down soon after, too cold and tired for more talk. Grace lay wrapped in blankets, listening to the cattle settle and the fire crackle. Somewhere out in the darkness, a coyote called, answered by another miles away. The sound was lonely and wild, perfectly suited to this empty land. She thought about Sterling and his hired guns, about the risk they were taking by challenging an established power. Part of her wanted to suggest they turn back, take the safe option of selling locally and accepting defeat. But the larger part, The part that had kept her walking through the blizzard when giving up would have been easier, refused to quit. They'd come this far. They'd see it through. Morning brought fresh snow, light but steady, coating everything in a new layer of white. The cattle were reluctant to move, having to be prodded and cajoled into motion. Grace rode drag position, keeping the stragglers moving, eating dust and snow kicked up by dozens of hooves. It was miserable work, but she did it without complaint, earning grudging respect from Tommy, who'd clearly expected her to fold. By afternoon the snow had stopped and the sun broke through, turning the world into a field of diamonds. Grace's spirits lifted slightly despite her exhaustion. They were making progress. Each mile brought them closer to Fort Supply and whatever waited there. Will rode back to check on her around mid-afternoon. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Grace was past exhaustion, running on pure stubbornness, but she wasn't about to admit weakness. "There's a trading post about 5 miles ahead. We'll stop there for the night, get a hot meal, and real beds. You've earned it." The promise of civilization, however rough, was almost painful in its appeal. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. The trading post materialized from the white landscape like a mirage. It was a low, sprawling building made of rough lumber with a stable attached and smoke rising from 2 chimneys. A hand-painted sign declared it to be Mackenzie's Post, Provisions, and Lodging. Never had anything looked more beautiful to Grace's eyes. The proprietor, a barrel-chested Scotsman named Duncan Mackenzie, greeted them with the enthusiasm of a man who saw few visitors in winter. Come in. Get those horses stabled and yourselves warm. I've got stew on and beds available." The interior of the trading post was dim and cluttered, every available surface covered with goods for sale. Blankets, tools, ammunition, canned foods, all jumbled together in cheerful chaos. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat, and the smell of cooking beef made Grace's stomach cramp with hunger. They ate Duncan's stew, thick with meat and potatoes, and sopped up the gravy with fresh bread. Grace thought it might be the best meal she'd ever eaten, though that was probably exhaustion and cold talking. When she'd cleaned her bowl twice, Duncan showed her to a small room with an actual bed and clean sheets. Grace collapsed onto the mattress and was asleep before she could remove her boots. She woke to voices in the main room, male voices, unfamiliar, speaking in low tones that carried an edge of threat. Grace sat up, instantly alert, and crept to the door to listen. "I'm telling you, Mackenzie, we're looking for a man named Carter, William Carter. Heard he might be heading this way with cattle." Duncan's voice, carefully neutral. "Lots of folks move cattle through here. Can't say I recall any Carter. Big man, dark hair, usually rides a roan gelding, traveling with an older cowboy and maybe a woman. Ring any bells now?" Grace's heart began to pound. She eased the door open a crack and peered through. 3 men stood by the stove, their backs to her. They wore heavy coats and gun belts, their postures aggressive despite Duncan's hospitality. The one doing the talking was tall and thin, with a face like a hatchet. "I told you I don't know any Carter." Duncan's voice had hardened. "And even if I did, I don't make a habit of discussing my customers with strangers." The thin man stepped closer, invading Duncan's space. "Maybe you need help remembering. Sterling doesn't like competition in his territory. He wants to make sure this Carter understands that before things get unpleasant." So these were Sterling's men. Grace had known there might be trouble, but she hadn't expected it to find them so quickly. She backed away from the door and looked around for a weapon. Her medical bag held a scalpel, small but sharp. Better than nothing. Before she could decide what to do, another door opened, and Will stepped into the main room. He must have been in the stable checking on the horses. He took in the scene instantly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "I'm Carter," he said quietly. "You boys looking for me?" The 3 men turned. The thin one smiled, showing bad teeth. "William Carter, Sterling wants a word with you." "Sterling can come talk to me himself. I don't deal with hired muscle." "That's not real friendly." The thin man's hand drifted toward his gun. "Mr. Sterling sent us all the way out here to deliver a message. Least you could do is listen polite-like." "I'm listening." "Mr. Sterling hears you're planning to sell cattle to Fort Supply. That's his territory. He's got a contract, legal and binding. He doesn't appreciate outsiders trying to horn in on his business." Will's expression didn't change. "Fort Supply can buy from whoever they want. That's how markets work. Not how this market works. Sterling's got an arrangement with Captain Morrison. You try to interfere with that arrangement, there'll be consequences. Is that a threat?" The thin man's smile widened. "Just information. What you do with it is your business. But if I was you, I'd turn those cattle around and head back where you came from. Save everyone a lot of trouble." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Grace saw Will's jaw tighten, saw his fingers flex near his gun. One wrong word and this would turn into a gunfight. She stepped into the room before she could think better of it. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "perhaps we could discuss this reasonably." All eyes turned to her. The thin man's expression shifted to surprise, then something uglier. "Well now, Sterling didn't mention Carter was traveling with a lady." "Miss Bennett is a nurse," Will said, his voice tight. "She's got nothing to do with cattle sales." "A nurse." The thin man looked her up and down in a way that made Grace's skin crawl. "Pretty thing like you, all alone out here with rough cowboys? That don't seem proper." Grace lifted her chin. "What doesn't seem proper is 3 armed men threatening honest businessmen. Mr. Carter has every right to sell his cattle wherever he chooses. If Mr. Sterling has a problem with that, he should take it up with the Army, not send thugs to intimidate people." The thin man's smile disappeared. "Careful with that mouth, lady. You don't want to make enemies out here." "I think you gentlemen should leave." Duncan had produced a shotgun from behind his counter. "I don't allow threatening talk in my establishment. You've delivered your message. Time to go." For a moment Grace thought they might refuse, might push it to violence. Then the thin man shrugged. "We'll go, but Carter, you remember what I said. Sterling protects his interests. You push this, you'll regret it." They left, the door slamming behind them. Grace heard their horses departing at a gallop. When the sound faded, she found her legs were shaking. Will crossed to her in 2 strides. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Who were they?" "Sterling's men. Like Tommy said, the kind who solve problems the hard way." He looked at Duncan. "Thank you for backing us." The Scotsman set his shotgun down. "I don't like bullies. Never have. But I'll warn you, lad. Sterling's got a long reach and he doesn't forget. You've made an enemy tonight." "I already had an enemy. At least now it's out in the open." Grace's mind was racing. "They knew we were coming. They knew about the cattle drive, knew we were heading to Fort Supply. How?" "Good question." Will's expression was grim. "Either someone at the ranch talked, or Sterling's got eyes everywhere. Either way, we're not going to surprise anyone now. So what do? What we planned. We get to Fort Supply, we make our pitch to Morrison, and we see if we can save the ranch. Sterling's threats don't change the mathematics." But it changed the danger, Grace thought. Sterling wasn't just going to let them waltz in and steal his contract. He'd fight back, and from what she'd seen of his men, he wouldn't fight fair. They left Mackenzie's at first light, pushing the cattle hard. Speed mattered now. The sooner they reached the fort, the less time Sterling had to interfere. Grace rode with new awareness, scanning the horizon for threats, starting at every unexpected sound. The open prairie that had seemed beautiful now felt exposed, vulnerable. The cattle sensed the tension and moved skittishly, requiring constant work to keep them bunched. Tommy rode point with his rifle across his saddle, eyes sharp. Will stayed close to Grace, his protective instinct clear even if he didn't voice it. They covered 25 miles that day, pushing through exhaustion and cold. When they finally made camp, all 3 of them were too tired for more than minimal conversation. Grace forced herself to eat, knowing she needed fuel, but tasted nothing. Her mind kept replaying the scene at Mackenzie's, the thin man's threats, the knowledge that somewhere out there Sterling's men were watching. Morning of the third day brought Fort Supply into view. It sprawled across a low rise, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a palisade wall. The American flag snapped in the wind above the parade ground, and Grace could see uniformed soldiers drilling in neat formations. Civilization. Safety. Or at least the illusion of it. They drove the cattle to a holding pen outside the fort, and Will went to request an audience with Captain Morrison. Grace stayed with the cattle, her medical training making her useful for checking them over, ensuring they were in good condition for inspection. These 40 head represented the best of the Circle W herd, prime beef, that should command premium prices if Morrison could be convinced to buy. Will returned an hour later with news. Morrison will see us this afternoon in his office. He's intrigued but non-committal. Says he has obligations to Sterling, but he's willing to listen. That's something. It's a start. Will looked at the cattle, his expression calculating. The question is whether we can offer him enough to break contract with Sterling. Price alone might not do it. We need to give him a reason to take the risk. Grace thought about this. What does the Army care about beyond price? Reliability, quality, consistent supply. Can we guarantee those things? If we keep the ranch, yes. Circle W cattle are as good as any in the territory. We've got water rights and grazing land to support a much bigger herd than we currently run. With proper management and capital, we could be Sterling's equal in 5 years. An idea was forming in Grace's mind. What if we offered more than just cattle? What if we offered medical services as well? Will looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Army posts need medical care. They have surgeons, sure, but probably not enough for all the men. What if I offered to provide nursing services, treat injuries and illnesses among the soldiers, free of charge as part of our cattle contract? That's value Sterling can't match. You'd do that? Commit to regular service here? Grace hadn't fully thought through the implications, but she nodded. If it saves the ranch, yes. I could ride out once a month, stay a few days, tend to whoever needs help. It would be good for the fort and good for our relationship with Morrison. Will studied her face. You never stop surprising me. Is that a yes? That's a we'll offer it and see what he says? Captain Andrew Morrison proved to be exactly as described. Tall and rigid, with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, he received them in an office that was sparse and organized to military perfection. He listened to Will's pitch without interruption, his expression giving nothing away. When Will finished, Morrison leaned back in his chair. Let me understand. You're offering to supply beef at $7 per head, delivered monthly, with guaranteed quality and quantity, and Miss Bennett here would provide medical services free of charge. That's correct, sir. My current contract with Sterling is for $8 per head, no medical services. On the surface, your offer is better. But Sterling has been reliable for 3 years. I know what I'm getting with him. You're an unknown quantity. We're not unknown, Captain. Will's voice was steady. The Circle W has been operating for 20 years. Ezekiel Whitmore built a reputation for quality stock and honest dealing. That reputation doesn't die with him. Whitmore is dead and you're about to lose the ranch to foreclosure. That doesn't inspire confidence in long-term reliability. The blunt words hit like physical blows, but Will didn't flinch. If you buy our cattle, we won't lose the ranch. We'll have the capital to pay off the bank and continue operations. You'll be investing in a partnership that benefits both of us. Morrison turned his attention to Grace. And you, Miss Bennett, you're willing to ride out here monthly, in all weather, to provide medical care to rough soldiers? That's a significant commitment for a young woman. Grace met his gaze directly. I'm a trained nurse, Captain. I worked in a hospital in Philadelphia for 18 months. I've treated everything from pneumonia to gunshot wounds. Your men deserve quality care, and I can provide it. Consider it part of our value proposition. Something that might have been respect flickered in Morrison's eyes. Sterling won't like this. He's got political connections, and he knows how to make trouble. With respect, sir, what Sterling likes isn't your concern. Your concern is getting the best deal for the United States Army. We're offering you that deal. Morrison was silent for a long moment, drumming his fingers on his desk. Finally he stood. I need to inspect your cattle personally. If they're everything you claim, and if Miss Bennett can demonstrate her medical competence to my satisfaction, I'll consider your offer. But I'm making no promises. Sterling's contract doesn't expire until summer. Breaking it early could create complications. We understand, sir. They spent the rest of the afternoon in a blur of activity. Morrison inspected the cattle with thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, checking teeth and hooves and general condition. Grace, meanwhile, was taken to the fort infirmary where the post surgeon, a gruff man named Dr. Phillips, questioned her extensively about her training and experience. Set a broken bone, he commanded, gesturing to a soldier who'd apparently fractured his wrist that morning. Grace examined the injury carefully. Simple fracture, clean break, easily treated if done properly. She worked quickly and efficiently, setting the bone and splinting it while Dr. Phillips watched with critical eyes. When she finished, he grunted. Not bad. Can you stitch? He produced a piece of leather and challenged her to demonstrate suturing technique. Grace took the needle and thread he offered and put in neat, even stitches, the kind she'd practiced hundreds of times on cadavers in Philadelphia. Doctor. Phillips examined her work and grunted again. You know what you're doing. I'll tell Morrison that. It was the closest thing to praise he seemed capable of, and Grace accepted it gratefully. They met with Morrison again that evening. The captain looked tired, the weight of decision heavy on his shoulders. Your cattle are excellent quality. Miss Bennett's medical skills are adequate, and your price is competitive. Under normal circumstances, I'd accept your offer immediately. Grace felt her heart sink at the word "but" she could hear coming. However, Morrison continued, I received a telegram from Sterling this afternoon. He's threatening to sue the Army for breach of contract if I buy from you. His lawyers are already preparing paperwork. It could tie us up in court for months. He's bluffing, Will said, though his voice lacked conviction. Contract disputes take time and money. Sterling doesn't want that any more than you do. Perhaps. But I can't afford the uncertainty. My superiors don't react well to legal entanglements. Morrison sighed. I'm sorry, Carter. I wish I could help you, but my hands are tied. Grace saw Will's shoulders slump, saw hope die in his eyes. They'd come so far, risked so much, and it wasn't enough. Sterling's political power trumped everything else, but she hadn't survived a blizzard to give up now. Captain Morrison, she said quietly, may I ask you something personal? He looked surprised, but nodded. Go ahead. How many men have you lost to preventable illness since you took command here? The question caught him off guard. I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. How many? Morrison's jaw tightened. 7. 3 to pneumonia, 2 to infected wounds, 1 to typhoid, 1 to appendicitis that went septic. 7 men. 7 families destroyed because of inadequate medical care. How much is that worth, Captain? How much would you pay to prevent the next death? Miss Bennett, I appreciate what you're offering, but I can't base military procurement decisions on sentiment. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to look at the complete value of our offer. Yes, Sterling can match our beef prices if he has to, but can he bring back those 7 dead soldiers? Can he prevent the next death? Because I can. Maybe not every time, but enough times that it matters. She took a breath, choosing her next words carefully. My father died of consumption. I watched him suffocate by inches over 2 years. Every day I wished for someone with real medical knowledge to help him. No one came. Those 7 soldiers, Captain, they had families too, people who loved them, who depended on them. Don't let Sterling's lawyers mean more than their lives. The office was silent. Morrison stared at Grace with an expression she couldn't read. Then he looked at Will. If I accept your offer, Sterling will make trouble. Political trouble, legal trouble, maybe worse. Are you prepared for that? We're already in trouble, Captain. We're trying to save a ranch from foreclosure. Sterling's threats are just one more problem on a long list. Morrison nodded slowly. All right, here's what I'll do. I'll buy these 40 head at $7 per with an option for monthly delivery of another 50 head at the same price. If Miss Bennett provides monthly medical services as promised, and if Sterling's legal threats don't materialize into actual consequences, I'll make the arrangement permanent and break contract with him this summer. It wasn't everything they'd hoped for, but it was enough. 40 head at $7 was $280. Another 50 per month was $350. Total of $630 for the first delivery. Not enough to pay the bank debt entirely, but combined with selling the rest of the herd locally, it might be close. Will extended his hand. Deal. Morrison shook it firmly. I'll have my quartermaster draw up the paperwork. You can collect payment tomorrow morning. They left his office in a daze. Outside, the sun was setting, painting Fort Supply in shades of amber and crimson. Grace felt lightheaded with relief and exhaustion. They'd done it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to have a fighting chance. Will stopped in the middle of the parade ground and turned to her. What you said in there. About your father, about those soldiers, that was manipulative, Grace finished. I know. But it was also true, every word of it. It was brave, and it might have just saved the Circle W. Before Grace could respond, Will pulled her into his arms. The embrace was sudden and fierce, his strength enveloping her completely. Grace froze for a heartbeat, then relaxed into it, letting herself be held. They stood like that for a long moment. Two people who'd been fighting alone, finding comfort in shared struggle. When Will finally released her, his eyes were bright with emotion he didn't try to hide. Thank you for everything, for not giving up, for believing this could work, for fighting when you had every reason to run. I didn't have anywhere to run to, Grace said, trying to keep it light. You're stuck with me. Good. Will's voice dropped lower. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as Whitmore's mail-order bride and started thinking of you as just Grace, the woman who's too stubborn to freeze to death, too smart to accept defeat, and too brave to let me face this alone. Grace's heart began to pound. Will, I know this isn't the time. We still have the ranch to save, the bank to pay off, Sterling to deal with. But when this is over, if we survive it, I'd like to... He paused, choosing words. I'd like to see if we could build something together, not because you were promised to a dead man, but because we choose it. Grace looked up at him, this hard, capable man who'd saved her life and let her save his in return. I'd like that too. They rode back to the Circle W with Morrison's payment secured and hope rekindled. The trip took 2 full days, and Grace spent most of it calculating numbers. The fort payment plus local sale of remaining cattle, plus the small reserve Rosa had hidden away, might total $3,000. They'd still be $200 short, but maybe the bank would accept partial payment and extend the deadline. Maybe. If they were lucky, if Garrison was feeling merciful. They weren't lucky. When they rode into the ranch compound, Jake was the first to greet them, his left arm out of the sling now, moving carefully, but moving. He flexed his fingers for Grace to see, the motion still stiff, but functional. It works, Miss Grace, he said, his young face splitting in a grin. Doc says I'll have full use back in another month. You saved my arm. Hell, you probably saved my life. Grace squeezed his shoulder gently. You saved yourself by being brave enough to let me try. Now go easy on it. No heavy lifting for another 3 weeks. Yes, ma'am. Jake tipped his hat and headed back toward the bunkhouse, his gait steady despite the injury. Will watched him go, then looked at Grace. You've changed this place. Changed all of us. Before Grace could respond, she saw who else was waiting in the yard. Garrison was waiting at the ranch when they arrived, standing in the yard with 2 men Grace didn't recognize, hard-faced men in dark suits who had lawyer written all over them. Carter, Garrison said pleasantly. Good timing. We were just about to post foreclosure notices. We have partial payment. Will dismounted and pulled the bank draft from his coat. $2,800. We need one more week to raise the rest. Garrison didn't even look at the draft. The deadline was February 15th. Today is February 16th. You're in default. One day. We're 1 day late because we were securing payment from Fort Supply. 1 day, 1 month, it's all the same. The terms were clear. Now this property belongs to the Cattlemen's Bank of Mobetti. Grace saw Will's hands curl into fists, saw the moment he considered violence, and forced it down. You can't do this. We have the money. We just need a few more days. I can, and I am. Gentlemen, if you would proceed. The lawyers began hammering foreclosure notices onto the barn, the house, the bunkhouse. Each hammer blow echoed like a death knell. The cowboys emerged from various buildings, watching in silent fury as their home was stolen. Grace felt rage building in her chest, hot and fierce. They'd worked so hard, come so close. This couldn't be the end. Then Rosa stepped forward, moving with the authority of a woman who'd seen enough injustice. You want this ranch so bad, Garrison? Then you pay for it proper. Every building, every fence post, every improvement Ezekiel Whitmore made in 20 years. You pay market value or you get nothing. Garrison smiled. I'm not buying the ranch, Mrs. Martinez. I'm foreclosing on it. The bank takes possession of all assets to satisfy the debt. That's how foreclosure works. Not when there's fraud involved. Rosa's voice cut like a knife. Ezekiel's will left this ranch to his workers, to be held in common trust. You can't foreclose on property that doesn't belong to the deceased. You need to go through probate court, and that takes months. Garrison's smile disappeared. What are you talking about? There's no trust. Benjamin Whitmore inherited everything. Benjamin inherited Ezekiel's personal property. The ranch was put in trust 3 months before Ezekiel died. He knew his heart was failing. He made arrangements. Rosa pulled a folded document from her apron pocket. This is a copy of the trust agreement filed with the territorial court in Denver. You want to foreclose? You'll have to prove the trust is invalid. That means lawyers and judges and a process that'll take at least 6 months, maybe a year. Garrison snatched the document and read it, his face going progressively redder. When he finished, he looked at Rosa with pure hatred. This is a forgery. It's witnessed and notarized. You can check with the court if you like. I'll wait. The silence that followed was profound. Grace watched understanding dawn on Garrison's face. The foreclosure was blocked, at least temporarily. The bank would get its money eventually, but not today, not on Garrison's timeline. He turned to his lawyers. Check this. Verify it's real. While they huddled together examining the document, Will leaned close to Rosa. Is it real? He whispered. Real as rain. Ezekiel set it up the month after his heart first started giving him trouble. Didn't tell anyone but me because he knew Benjamin would fight it. The trust names you as trustee, Will. Until it's dissolved or probate is complete, you have legal authority over the ranch. Will looked stunned. Why didn't you mention this before? Because I wasn't sure we'd need it. I was hoping you could pay the debt and avoid all this mess. But since Garrison wants to play hardball, he gets to discover that Ezekiel Whitmore was smarter than him. Garrison's lawyer confirmed the trust was legitimate. The banker's expression went from angry to calculating. Fine. The foreclosure is delayed pending probate. But that doesn't change the fact that you owe $3,200. The trust doesn't make that debt disappear. No, Rosa agreed. But it gives us time to pay it proper. The trust agreement requires the bank to accept reasonable payment plans for outstanding debts. We'll pay you $1,000 now, and the rest in monthly installments over the next year. That's not acceptable. Take it to a judge then. See how he feels about banks trying to steal ranches from dying men who were making good faith efforts to pay their debts. Garrison knew when he was beaten, but he wasn't finished. Fine, I'll accept a payment plan. But I want $500 today as down payment. Proof you're serious. The rest in monthly installments. Will's expression went flat. They had $280 from the Fort payment. Rosa had hidden away $180 in emergency funds. That left them $20 short of Garrison's demand. "We can give you $460 today," Grace said quickly. "Every dollar we have, the rest monthly over 18 months at reasonable interest, or you can wait a year for probate to finish and get nothing until then." Garrison calculated, his face tight with frustration. Finally he nodded. "$460 today, $2,740 in monthly payments over 18 months. That's $152 per month. Miss one payment and the foreclosure proceeds immediately, trust or no trust." It was crushing, but it was survival. Will counted out the money while Garrison's lawyer drew up the amended agreement. When they finished, Garrison signed a receipt and left with his lawyers in tow. The foreclosure notices came down. When they were gone, the entire ranch seemed to exhale collectively. Cowboys emerged fully from buildings, their postures relaxing. Will stood in the center of the yard, looking like a man who'd been in a fight and wasn't sure if he'd won or lost. Grace went to him. "It's over. We saved it. For now. We still owe $2,000, and we have monthly payments to make. If we miss even one, Garrison will come back. Then we won't miss any." Grace took his hand. "We'll make this work. Together." Will looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. "I love you. I don't know when it happened, somewhere between you refusing to die in the snow and you facing down Sterling's men and you standing up to Morrison. But I love you, Grace Bennett." The words should have shocked her, but they didn't. Somewhere along the way, without consciously deciding it, she'd fallen in love with this hard, stubborn man who fought for everything he cared about and never gave up. "I love you too." He kissed her then, in front of the entire ranch, a kiss that was promise and celebration and relief, all mixed together. When they broke apart, the cowboys were cheering, Rosa was crying, and the sun was setting over the Circle W in shades of gold and crimson. That night, sitting around the fire in the main house, Will pulled a small object from his pocket. It was a ring, simple silver with a small turquoise stone, clearly handmade. "This was Sarah's," he said quietly. "I'd like you to have it, not because I'm trying to replace her, but because I'm choosing a future with you, if you'll have me." Grace took the ring, feeling the weight of what he was offering. Not just marriage, but partnership. Not just security, but love. Everything she'd traveled west hoping to find, offered now by a man she'd never expected to meet. "Yes," she said, yes, I'll marry you." They married a week later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, Rosa officiating with authority granted by her years and experience. The cowboys stood witness, their weathered faces split by rare smiles. Grace wore a dress Rosa had made from fabric stored away for special occasions, white cotton with lace at the collar. When Will slipped the ring onto her finger, Grace thought about the long journey that had brought her here, the blizzard that should have killed her, the dead man whose letters had promised her a future, the desperate gamble that had saved a ranch, the love she'd found in the last place she expected. Life had a strange way of working out, she thought. Not always the way you planned, but sometimes better than you dreamed. A year after the wedding, Grace gave birth to a daughter. They named her Anna Rose Carter, after Will's first wife and the woman who'd given Grace shelter that frozen night. Will wept when he held his daughter, and Grace knew he'd finally made peace with the ghosts that had haunted him. The Circle W prospered. Monthly payments to Garrison's bank were made without fail. Grace's medical practice expanded beyond the ranch, with cowboys and families riding from 50 miles away to see the nurse who'd survived the blizzard. Fort Supply renewed their cattle contract every year, and Captain Morrison became a friend. 5 years passed in the rhythm of seasons. 2 more children came, a son named Ezekiel Thomas, and another daughter they called Sarah Grace. The debt to the bank was paid in full. Will expanded the herd to 800 head. Grace trained 2 young women as nursing assistants, passing on everything she'd learned in Philadelphia. 25 years after Will had pulled her from that killing snow, they stood together on the ridge overlooking their land. Anna Rose had married a rancher from New Mexico and had 4 children. Ezekiel managed the cattle operations with the same quiet competence his father had shown. Sarah was studying medicine in Chicago, determined to become the first female doctor in the territory. "We built something good," Will said, his hair silver now, but his hands still strong. Grace leaned against him, the turquoise ring still bright on her weathered finger. "We built something that lasts." On a spring morning, 43 years after their wedding, Will Carter died peacefully in his sleep at 75. Grace held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering the same words he'd said to her in the blizzard. "I've got you. I'll always have you." She lived 7 more years, long enough to meet her great-grandchildren, to see the Circle W grow to 1,500 head, to watch Sarah return from medical school and open the territory's first hospital. On a warm September afternoon when she was 78, Grace Bennett Carter closed her eyes for the last time, surrounded by the family she'd built from nothing but courage and love. They buried her beside Will on that ridge where they'd stood so many times, looking out over the land they'd saved together. The stone was simple granite, the inscription chosen by her granddaughter. Grace Bennett Carter, 1866 to 1944, the blizzard bride who became a legend. And on winter nights when the wind howls across the Texas Panhandle, old-timers at the Circle W still tell the story. About the woman who refused to die in a blizzard, about the cowboy who found her, about how they saved a ranch with nothing but stubborn hope and refused to quit, about how sometimes the worst mistakes lead to the best lives. The Circle W still stands, 6 generations later, run by Grace and Will's great-great-grandchildren. In the main house hangs a photograph, faded now, of a young woman in a simple wedding dress, standing beside a tall cowboy with eyes like summer sky. Below it, in a glass case, rests a turquoise ring and a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. Letters from a dead man that brought her west. Letters that changed everything. Letters that, in the end, led her exactly where she was meant to be.